The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by Medtronic. Medtronic is dedicated to the pursuit of life-transforming health tech. From AI to robotics and beyond, we're reinventing what's possible, and we're just getting started. Visit Medtronic.com to learn more.
LinkedIn presents.
I'm Maura Aarons-Mele, and this is The Anxious Achiever, the show that looks at the intersection of mental health and work, and how we can all do both better. Bias is everywhere, right? And it has a huge impact on our lives. The stigma that still exists around mental health is just one bias I see day in and day out. And the thing that happens with bias in the workplace is that it holds people back from advancement, from success in careers. On the show, we've talked about racial and gender and age bias. We've talked about what it feels like to be seen as other, to be seen as lesser, and something called the anxiety of the only. Today, we're going to talk about a bias that maybe you've not even really thought about, or maybe you experience it deeply every day. Accent bias. My guest, Heather Hansen, challenges the notion of good and bad English, emphasizing instead that great and effective communication is about getting your message across, regardless of your accent. English is the dominant language in global business, right? And there's a bad side effect of our globalized world. It's a bias against people whose English sounds, quote, accented. You'll hear Heather say, everyone has an accent. It's just that some are more prized than others. Heather is also speaking widely on the subject and increasing awareness. We'll dive into the assumptions people have about one's ability to speak English in the quote, unquote, right accent, and what it means for people's mental health, and what it means for multinational companies, education, and even culture today. She'll share the change she wants to enact and how we all can get involved. I started by asking Heather why she thinks her work is hitting such a nerve right now, in this moment.
I think in general, it's because it's so personal. The way that we speak, the way we express ourselves, it is as personal a part of our identity as you can get. And so when someone challenges that part of your identity, it's very personal. As to why right now, this is a topic that I have wanted to talk about on my soapbox for over a decade. And I felt like the world wasn't ready. When I would talk about these things, people didn't really get it. And it really took the diversity and inclusion movement. It took the pandemic. It took Black Lives Matters. It took Me Too before we started being a little bit more open to talking about these types of issues, about who we are and how we're showing up in the world. And I think that might be why now it is becoming a much more interesting topic to discuss.
You mentioned the pandemic. Did the move to sort of more digitally mediated meeting formats sort of hasten the urgency, do you think?
Very possibly, because what I saw, and I mean, I'm based in Singapore, so it's a real regional hub. And when we went into the pandemic, things moved much more regional and global. Now we could have calls and have leaders on calls who maybe only flew in once a quarter or for some larger leadership event, or maybe they only saw each other once a year. Now everyone was starting to interact a lot more from the privacy of their home offices. And so they were interacting more, they were misunderstanding each other more. We had the digital divide where being online and audio only or bad connections were impeding communication in new ways. And now accent and communication styles were taking center stage. I mean, my business tripled during the pandemic because suddenly the hot topic that we had to learn how to manage was our communication. Whereas before that was just a nice to have. We didn't really think about it. And now all of a sudden, we've become so global, so international, so quickly. Even if you're sitting in my hometown in California, the world is coming to you. You can't avoid it. And we're learning very, very quickly how to manage differences. And this is something in the cross-cultural world we've been interested in forever. But now we're starting to understand that those same skills you need for cross-cultural understanding and communication can also be applied to interpersonal differences and learning differences and how we interact with each other. So yeah, I think definitely the pandemic and moving online has made it a bigger issue for us in figuring out how we communicate with each other.
How do you define what you call accent bias, and what are typical ways it shows up?
Accent bias is basically a bias against or a preference for a certain dialect. And I would even broaden that to a style of speech. So it may not only be the way the speech sounds, like a Southern accent versus a New Yorker versus a Californian, or those regional differences. It may not only be that, it also can include more dialectal features. So that would include the vocabulary, the slang, the patterning, the way that we speak, not just the accent. So it is a much broader topic, but I've found that when we start by talking about accent, we can then build toward the differences in communication styles, because I think there's a lot of crossover with this topic also as we move into areas like neurodiversity and the differences in communication style, and the same rules apply. It's really how are we interacting and communicating across different styles of communication and the way it sounds.
So obviously, when we talk about bias, there is a norm
Yes.
that we are sort of aspiring to, that if you don't meet the norm. So how would you define the norm in sort of corporate business, which is the world that you work in, I guess the
Right.
world that I work in, the norm both of accent, but also, again, you talk about style. Like, what is the sort of traditional status-driven norm?
Yeah, and that's exactly what it is a status-driven norm. So it's what variety holds the highest prestige. Depending on where you are in the world, it can differ, it can change, and it can change over time. But generally, the one that is seen as the norm or the standard is the one that you will see newscasters using, the variety that it has been sort of institutionalized as proper English. And this is true of every language. It's not just English, but since we're in an English-speaking world, I'm going to refer primarily to English. So in America, it's the general American dialect, which is what it's called. It's from the Midwestern area. And that is considered general American, highest prestige, neutral variety. There is no such thing as a neutral variety of any language. And then in the UK, it has typically been received pronunciation, RP. That is the gold standard. That's what's in all of the English language textbooks around the world with the CDs that come with it. This is now finally changing. We have some great books coming out just in the last couple months about pronunciation teaching in global settings, which is fantastic. So this is a big hot topic in English language teaching worldwide as to what should the model be.
Right.
And historically, it has been general American and received pronunciation. I mean, even the King of England does not speak with pure received pronunciation anymore. The BBC, since the early 80s or late 70s, actually officially changed their stance to say we want more regional accents. That hasn't necessarily happened. Recent studies have shown there's still only about 20% regional accents and the rest are RP. So this is still alive and well. From a more international perspective, I find Singapore to be incredibly interesting. This is why I want to study accent bias for my PhD here in Singapore, because we are such an international hub and we have people from all over the world. I can hold a dinner party and invite 12 people and they're from 12 different countries and we speak 25 languages between the 12 of us. I mean, it is fantastic, right? But then why do we still see certain varieties of English rising to the top? So among Singaporeans right now, they prefer an American English accent over their own Singapore accent. Why
Really?
is that? Why can
Not
they,
a British accent.
not British? And that's been a shift. Because when I first came to Singapore in 2006, I started my company in 2007. And at that time, I actually had someone ask me once, but how can you teach pronunciation? You're American. So
You don't know how to talk.
you have no idea how to speak English. So absolutely, because of the colonial history, it was always British English, and standard Singapore English also follows the British model. That is the ideal proper form. But it is changing very quickly, especially with younger generations who have been raised on YouTube and Netflix and American media. So this is constantly changing throughout the world. And what I'm very interested in learning more about and understanding better is, how does this play out now in a multinational environment, a multinational company? Is it just based on who's the boss, right? I mean, if it's a Brit, and that's typically what I found. If it's a Brit who is the boss, then the person is being sent to me to sound more British. If it is an American that's the boss, then they're being sent to me to sound more American. It's very much that kind of system that I see playing out over the last, over 15 years. But I think we're slowly making some progress here. I hope we are anyway.
You mentioned colonialism. Obviously, the accents that are looked to in sort of global business are British, huge imperial power, and America, also an imperial power in a different way. How do the roots of colonialism play out in your work?
They are everywhere. They're everywhere. And I would even say, it continues today through imperialism, through American media, through geopolitics, just through the way the world works. English is an incredibly dominant language, and a lot of power comes with that. I don't think that we stop to realize how incredibly privileged we are. Simply being born into English, we are so privileged. And that the world speaks English. And let's keep in mind that only about a quarter of the world speaks English. So 75% of the world's population is not a part of our global discussions, what we think is our entire world. 75% of the world is not a part of that. And I think it's important for us to remember that. So we're in this small 25% of the world's population who's running the show, who's making the decisions, who's determining peace and war and economic ties and trade and everything else.
And what's cool.
Yeah, what's cool and what isn't. We're defining culture. We decide where the money flows. So we are incredibly privileged. And it's interesting, going back through the colonial ties, English is the world's language because of colonialism. It's not the most widespread language in the world. There are more Mandarin speakers in the world. There are more Hindi speakers in the world. But why aren't those languages our global language? It's because those languages are not spoken as widely as English. And why is English spoken widely? Because we had missionaries, we had colonists who went out to conquer the world and the world's people and used language as a form of control. Language is an incredible weapon. When you take over a country and you say, now you're going to speak this language, the people who speak it earn immediate status and prestige, and that's where the money will be and where they'll gain respect. The people who don't speak it are left out of the society. So we use language in language planning and nation building to maintain control in different countries. And what's interesting is even present day language planning. There's another doctoral student in one of my classes. We're taking a language planning class at the moment, and she's from Taiwan, and she's studying language planning in Taiwan. And Taiwan has a 2030 bilingual plan where they hope to make sure that everyone in Taiwan speaks English by 2030.
Wow.
I mean, that's pretty amazing. And a lot of the arguments will be, well, it's a neutral language. There's nothing neutral about English in Taiwan. There is nothing neutral. It's all about distancing from China, mainland China, and aligning with America, right? So you can see how language is very political. It's wrapped up in power and hierarchy, prestige and status. And when we put that into an organization and the interactions we're having within it, that creates a whole set of challenges.
Okay, so let's drill down. Walk us through an example of how all of this plays out in the workplace. Say one of your clients who is in a situation where they are being asked to conform to this more neutral presentation because it will help them get ahead in their career. How does this play out?
A really good example, also because it has the American twist on it. This was a Frenchman who had been working abroad all over the world for many years, 8 years in Asia, 8 years in London, now moved to America and to the Midwest, where the general American accent is very well known, and working for a Fortune 250 company. And HR calls me and says he's currently acting CFO. We would like to make him the real CFO, but he has a really strong French accent. None of the Americans can understand him. And I thought, okay. And the problem here, and it is a very real problem, there's a fine line here between what is intelligible and comprehensible and what is accent bias. This individual would have to do the quarterly financial reports for the company. Thomson Reuters would be on the call, they'd be transcribing. I looked at those transcriptions. When we started, they were about 64% accurate. That's a huge problem. Huge.
Yes. Because he's giving guidance
Right.
to Wall Street and to analyst, right? Okay.
Yes, everyone's listening. Everyone's, listening.
Mhm.
So it was a serious problem. We could document the problem that the Americans can't understand him. But then I see his CV and I'm like, how is this possible? This person has, lived all over the world, been so super successful, is absolutely the right person for the job. And this is the one thing holding him back because the Americans don't understand him. What is wrong with the Americans is what I was thinking, because I looked at his CV and I'm going, it's not possible. I get on a call with him and sure enough, he speaks more clearly than any French client I have ever worked with. And I thought, this is really interesting because there's obviously a problem here. I could not hear the problem. He could not hear the problem. There was definitely a documented problem. And we had to go through and figure out how to change the vowels to be more American, to slow down the pace, to get the word endings to work on the R. We had to really Americanize his speech, which is something I typically refuse to do. I refuse to work on anything that is termed accent reduction, accent neutralization. I'm very much against that. But in this particular case, it was very specific that we had to play to that specific audience. And if he could not do that, he would not succeed. So is this a case of bias or not? Because we had the documented evidence, I would actually argue that there was not necessarily a lot of bias at play in this situation because it was truly an issue of intelligibility. The Americans couldn't understand. Now, if we look at the other side of that equation, however, I would argue that anyone who is sent for any kind of accent training or whatever you want to call it, and there's a huge, huge industry in the States of people teaching this, I would argue that everyone on the other side of the equation, the whole leadership, should also be in training. And they should be trained in how to better understand accents, how to have more contact with accents, learn the listening skills that are necessary to understand people who sound different. That's a skill set we have never been taught, especially as English-speaking Americans, monolinguals. Why would we need that? We don't think about it. And so the problem here is that the Americans listening to him had never had contact with that accent.
It's like we have lazy ears.
Yes,
almost.
exactly. It's exactly that. We do have lazy ears and lazy brains, right? I mean, going to like Daniel Kahneman and the fast thinking, slow thinking brains and all of those things, we are very lazy. And the minute it's hard, we kind of turn off. And that's where bias can come in, because what a lot of studies have found, we'll measure 3 different things. We measure accentedness, which is how different do you feel the accent is from yours? How difficult is it? Is it heavy or is it light? And we can measure that on a Likert scale, heavy accent, light accent, in the listener's opinion. Then we'll also look at intelligibility. So that's usually done with a dictation. So you listen to this French speaker, give the report. It's exactly what I did to find out, 64% intelligibility, because I could look at the words he said versus the words that they wrote down. So we have accentedness, intelligibility, but then we also have comprehensibility. And that is the listener's opinion of how hard it was to understand. So not how heavy the accent was, but how hard was it for me to understand? And what's really interesting when we look at those is someone can score very, very high on intelligibility. They could have 85%, 90% correct, like they wrote down the dictation perfectly, but they'll say, the person's accent was so heavy. They were so hard to understand. I couldn't understand a word. I couldn't understand any of it. And so these things don't necessarily match up. And we could argue, we don't have all the answers. We need so much more research in this area. But we could argue that perhaps because we're mentally focused on hearing and writing the word, that we aren't getting the overall comprehension. That could be taking away from the comprehension side. But what we see across the board is that when it gets difficult, we shut down. We don't want to listen. And then we take that sort of negative experience with us into the next time we meet a French-speaking person. And then if you take it to the broader perspective of how you've grown up, the shows you've watched, all of those things. So anyway, this is an interesting example from an American perspective of how this could play out and the very fine line that we see between bias and intelligibility. There are other situations that are very clearly straight up bias. These are people where usually HR will call and say, we have this person we want to promote to C-suite. We know that this person is 100% the right person for the job. They've been with us for 20 years. They know the company inside and out. But we just feel the person doesn't have enough presence. Okay, what does that mean? Well, we just don't think this person is, global enough. Okay, what does that mean? What do you want me to do with this person? It truly, this could be a 15-minute long conversation of me digging, because I'm not going to say it. I'm going to make them say it. And by the end of it, they will finally say, well, we just think this person sounds a bit too Singaporean. Can you make them sound a little more like you? And it's like, that's interesting. Okay, so why do you feel that this person needs to sound like me? You're a Singapore company. The person is Singaporean. You have a Singaporean board of directors. Why is it important this person sounds like me or speaks in a style that's like me? And a lot of people have internalized this. So if people come to me themselves without being sent to me, they'll usually come and say, well, I want to sound like you. I want to sound like a native speaker. Well, first of all, most Singaporeans are native speakers. They're born and raised in English. They're fully educated in English. Most of them are speaking English at home now. We've seen in the last census that the largest number ever percentage is speaking English at home. So there's a huge shift towards that. And that's part of the bias as well, because they know having English is going to get them further locally and globally. But they'll come to me saying, I want to sound like a native speaker. And I'll be like, okay, well, you are one, but what does that mean to you? What is it about the way that I speak that you like? And they'll usually say things like, well, I like how clear you speak. Or I like the melody in your voice. I like how you can go up and down and how it sounds so fluid. And I want to sound like that, because Singapore English is quite staccato. It's coming from primarily the Mandarin Chinese, where every character has the same emphasis and stress, although the tone changes. And so they bring that into English and it can sound very staccato. They articulate every syllable with the same sort of strength, or at least that's how it would sound to us. And so it has a very different sound to it. But what they're asking for is actually not to sound like a native speaker. They don't want an American accent. It's rare that they'll say, I want to sound American. Sometimes they do. I want to sound American. I want to sound British. And then I'll say, well, what is it about that American accent you like? And when they start explaining it, I'll try to make it clear to them, okay, it's not really the accent you want. It's the articulation. Because when I go home to California, people say I talk funny. So I don't speak the way I was raised. I know that over time I've subconsciously changed that in order to enhance understanding, because I deal with very large international audiences of people at very different language levels. So of course I've naturally changed the way I speak. I'm not sure exactly how, but yeah, now I talk funny when I go home.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. In the last 100 years, we've seen financial markets swing, new currencies come and go, decades of savings lost in days, all showing that a retirement plan without a guarantee, quite simply, isn't enough. So more than a retirement plan, TIAA makes you a retirement promise. A promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. A promise that pays off. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
You have such a clear enunciation. People always comment to me about my voice because I'm a podcaster. And so the thing that they say is that you're so easy to listen to. You calm me down.
Yeah.
And I was reflecting on the melody of certain accents in English versus staccato. That might be a bias that a lot of Americans grow up with. We love Australian accents. We like South African accents. It's so interesting.
Yeah. And it is really interesting when you start to think about how our accents portrayed in the media.
Yeah.
Because that's where we start learning this. We start learning it with Disney films, you know. And if you, I think of the ones I grew up with. My very favorite was Aladdin. I loved Aladdin, and Jafar is, you know, the big villain, and he has this really deep British voice. And then his little sidekick is this like New Yorker sounding parrot that, you know, kind of draws from that street smart feel that we have, that stereotype about New Yorkers, rough and you know, street smart, and then the only ones who have the general American are Aladdin and Jasmine, are big heroes of the story. The silly guards and street people all have sort of a faked Arab sounding, foreign sounding accent, but those are all just the guards, the low people, the people on the street. They're the ones that actually have a more ethnic sounding accent, right?
So you can see the hierarchy playing out even in the casting of a Disney film.
Yes.
Wow.
Lion King's incredible. The two main lions, and I always forget all their names, Mufasa, I think, and Scar. They are supposed to be brothers in this story, and they are in Africa, and Mufasa has the American hero voice, and Scar has the dark British voice, the villain voice. It's like, how does that even work? Where's the logic in that? But we never stop to question it. We don't even think about it because it fits so perfectly that, of course, the bad guy's British. I mean, of course, right?
Coming back to the hierarchy, like what I'm hearing with my ear is a tremendous amount of anxiety in all of this. Anxiety on the part, obviously, of the person who's struggling to be comprehended and interpreted. Even anxiety on the part of HR and the organization who wants to promote this person. How do you encounter in your work and manage through all the feelings around this stuff?
Yeah, this is really hard. And that goes back to where we started, you know, how personal this is. There tends to be an expectation that people can just change the way they speak. And that's not really easy to do. The way you speak is who you are. And you don't really want to change that. Some people might want to find a sense of belonging. I mean, I lived in Denmark for 8 years in 2 stints, and I'm married to a Dane. We speak Danish and English at home. And I have a very strong American accent on my Danish. I mean, the minute I open my mouth, people are all confused. Like, wait a second, you look like you're Danish, but you're not Danish. And what are you speaking right now? And for a long time, it's like, oh, I wish I could just get this accent so I could finally belong. But in the end, it was like, but why? You know, I am American. I'm not Danish. I'm never going to be Danish. And as long as I live here, I'm always going to be seen as other. And that does create a lot of anxiety. You know, I'm not the same person when I speak Danish. I don't raise my hand as quickly to ask a question. I don't volunteer to speak. Whereas in English, it's like, yeah, bring it. I'm ready for anything. Put me on any stage, even though I'm incredibly nervous as well in English. So I think we have to remember that. Like, think how anxiety ridden speaking in public or just speaking up in a meeting is for all of us who use English as our first language. And then multiply that by like 100 to try to navigate a workplace and the mental load, the extra mental load that's involved with that, as well as the emotional load of wanting to belong, not being othered constantly, wanting your voice to be heard, not having people ignore you or avoid you because they're afraid they might not understand you, or you avoid people because you're worried they won't understand you. And it's constant. It's like a constant management. You know, I mean, we talk, and I believe you even talk about it in your book, you know, the psychological cost of being that underrepresented minority and the emotional toll that takes on you. And what's interesting is in the international workplace, you are very likely not the minority. You're actually the majority who does not have English as your first language. And yet you're being forced to perform in a way that is impossible. There is no perfect English. It is all created. It's a social construct that gives certain amounts of status, right? And so it is very emotional. It is very anxiety laden. It is very hard. And I've lived both sides of this, right? Because living and working in a foreign language. I've experienced it myself. And then I've been on the absolute opposite end of the spectrum here in Singapore, where my style of speech is put on the pedestal and I'm given unearned status. Someone who's done a lot of really excellent work on this is Aarons-Mele at Harvard Business School. And right now she's really known for remote work revolution and all these digital workplace and her latest books. But she started her dissertation is actually on this idea of status in English in multinational companies. And she studied Rakuten, a Japanese firm that switched to English overnight. She studied them for 4 years to look at how the dynamics changed in that organization by forcing everyone from one day to the next to start speaking English.
Overnight.
He went in, gathered his 350 plus employees in Tokyo, Japanese employees, and says, from tomorrow, we speak English here. And sure enough, they walk in the next day, all the signs in the cafeteria have been changed to English. The computer systems changed to English. Everything is in English. And he basically said, you have 3 years to make it to intermediate or upper intermediate level English. We will support you in that. We will give you the training. But if you do not pass the appropriate tests, you will be basically will not get the next promotion, or we will move you down a level. So there was a very specific repercussion for that. So imagine the anxiety going throughout that organization for those 3-4 years. And at the same time, we have the employees in America that are like, yeah, unearned status gain, right? Like, awesome. Now they all have to speak my language. And now I'm the big boss because, I have the privilege of owning this language. So you can just imagine the challenges that came up there. And she's done some really, really excellent work. I absolutely love the work that she's done on this. And she's one of the only people I've seen really try to bring this forward and written on it extensively.
I think your point about the emotional load and the constant encoding that you have to do when you're really actively working on, I guess, what they call performance management, right? Trying to be heard, trying to conform to a norm. Of course, I would imagine that race obviously plays into this as well when it's coupled with accent.
Huge. And I mean, we can look at that in the United States as well, because we have about 30 different dialects in the US, and many of those are ethnic dialects. This is a very, very touchy subject, especially in the US. John McWhorter, who's a linguist, has written a book called Talking Back, Talking Black. And it's a very good book about this. And he talks about how it's very natural for us to hear race. We can hear it. We can even hear it on Obama. I mean, we can hear if someone is Black. That is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not being discriminatory. Because when you hear a voice, you make a number of assumptions. People listening to our podcast right now, if they haven't seen a picture of me, they are listening and saying, okay, how old is she? What does she look like? What race is she? How well educated is she? Where is she from? What's her socioeconomic status? And we can hear all of that.
But more than that, we listen for it.
We listen for it too. We do. It's like our brains go into overdrive. Like, I need to categorize this person. I have to know. I have to know their background. I have to know what box to put them in. Even sexuality.
Absolutely. There are Reddit threads. After I met you and we had an initial conversation, I went down a rabbit hole of Americans who are not Midwestern white sounding, but are in the media. There are entire subreddits devoted to people tearing apart, analyzing commentary.
Oh, it's awful. I'm not surprised, sadly, but it's pretty awful. But yeah, we listen for it and we categorize. This is a pretty natural thing that our brain just does. But the problem comes in when you then make a decision based on those categorizations that you've just created, because they are created. You have no idea if they're correct or not. So if that then translates to, I don't think I want to invite that person in for an interview because I've heard the way that they speak. We all carry these biases and they are so incredibly deep. And I catch myself. I know all of this. I study it. It is my passion. And I am very aware of my biases and I call myself out all the time. Right now, there is one particular student in one of my classes. Every time she opens her mouth, it's like, I cannot listen to this person. What is it? And I've been trying to work out, what is it about the way she speaks, the way she sounds, her accent that is triggering me? What does it remind me of? What character have I heard that talks like that? Or what experience did I have with someone that was negative that implanted that? The one that I hear complained about the most is usually Indian English, especially from Americans.
Hmm.
And I think that really goes back to the call centers. Because what happens, right? You're having difficulty on your computer. Something isn't working. You're super aggravated, upset. Your time is being wasted. Then you call the call center for help and you get someone based in India. And then your frustration level is already up. And then you're having difficulty understanding the accent because you have no contact with that accent. You've never heard it. You don't interact with it on a daily basis. I mean, I understand these accents just fine because I live among them in Singapore. We have a huge Indian population. But an American sitting in my hometown, no. And so then you have this really negative interaction. Why can't you just learn English? Well, likely that person grew up speaking English and it's their native language, by the way. But we have this super negative interaction. And then that sits in us. And then what happens when you're now a grown up, you're working, you're at work and you have your IT department in India and you need to deal with them regularly. And there is no charge in that interaction, but there's something that just grates on you. And that's going back to those earlier experiences and how you've anchored those emotions through those experiences. And then they come up again. But the problem is in the workplace, you may not realize it. And instead of recognizing that bias that you have and the fact that you're not really listening to that person, you're not respecting them the same way you do your white American boss that sounds like you. If you aren't aware of that, it's very easy to treat them differently. I think we're at the very, very beginning of this conversation, the very, very first step, which is simply becoming more aware of our biases because we've never, ever thought about it before. And that's just step number one for us is to start understanding where they come from, how characters have been stereotyped in the media, in storybooks growing up, and what experiences we have had or not had with accented varieties of English and how that has formed the way we listen to people, because it definitely changes the level of respect that we give to people when we hear them speak.
For someone listening to this conversation who is managing this anxiety and is maybe sort of even having a moment of like, this is affecting me, this is me, what steps do you recommend?
Yeah, I think it's important we look at both sides of that equation. So the person who feels like they have an accent that's different or they feel like they're being othered quite a bit because of that accent, it's really important to keep talking. And I know it's really, really hard because I've been there, I've lived it. But by silencing your voice and pressing mute and not speaking up because you're worried they won't understand and it's going to be embarrassing and you're going to have to go through it again and they're going to ask where you're from and how long you've lived here and you have to go through that whole thing in every conversation. So what happens is we tend to become quiet. That's the worst thing you can do because the other person needs to hear you more. They need to hear the way that you speak. They need to attune their ear to the sounds that you make that are different from theirs so that they can start to understand you better. If you remain quiet, they'll never understand you. So it's really important to keep talking and keep those communication lines open. From the other perspective, it would be what I was just saying, to start getting really serious about understanding what your biases are. If you've grown up and you believe you don't have an accent, which 30% of my audiences believe they do not have an accent, that's the first question I ask in a poll for almost all of my talks.
Wow.
And it's across the board, usually around 30% say, I don't have an accent. We all have accents. And it's about understanding what is your accent? How does it differ from others? What do you need to do to better understand accents? How can you increase the different varieties of English you hear on a regular basis? And how can you get to know your reactions and what you believe about people based on the way they sound? So it has to happen on both sides so that we can meet somewhere in the middle and improve that communication.
Keep listening, keep talking.
Yeah.
Heather, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me and giving me the opportunity. I'm so passionate about this, and I think we're just at the very beginning. There's so much more to learn.
That's it for today. Our show is produced and edited by Mary Dew. Our assistant producer and sound engineer is Nick Krinko. Many thanks to the LinkedIn Presents family and to all our guests for sharing their stories. If you love the show, tell your friends. I would love you to leave a review because they really matter in helping the show get found. You could also follow us or subscribe. If you have a question for me or you want to submit an idea for the show, find me on LinkedIn, where you can follow me, message me, I promise I'll write back, or subscribe to my newsletter for more from the Anxious Achiever world. Thanks for listening.